All right. So we got the Battle of Britain. We're looking at the second part of lesson 5. Here we go. Second part of lesson 5. So this starts in July 11th, 1940. And it technically ends on October 31st, 1940. But really the bombing raids continue into January and early February of 1941. But the technical campaign or battle of the Battle of Britain goes from July through October. Hitler and Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, devised a plan that the only way to launch a British water-to-land invasion, amphibious assault on the heavily fortified British coast, is to take out the Royal Air Force. The plan for the amphibious assault is known as Operation Sea Lion, and the goal in the summer of 40 is to lead a large-scale bombing campaign. So Operation Sea Lion can be launched at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall of 40. Obviously, the British Royal Navy outnumbered the Nazi Navy, but at this period of time, the British were having a pretty big problem with the submarine or U-boat wolf packs that were in the North Sea and in the Atlantic. So the first tactic of this campaign of the German Luftwaffe is to go in and bomb airfields, munitions factories, and any other industrial factories. The RAF and the British military are spread pretty thin. In fact, starting in the summer and through the entire campaign, the RAF these pilots were flying multiple missions every day to try to keep up with the massive wave of German bombers and fighters that were being sent in. However, on an accidental assault in August, the Luftwaffe dropped bombs on London. This was the first time that civilian targets were hit. In response, in August, the British did a bombing raid on Berlin. The British Royal Air Force was led by Lord Hugh Dowding. In response to the attack on Berlin, the Nazis called off the bombing on the airfields, called off the bombing on the military targets, and started focusing on London cities. What Hitler is not aware of, and what Hermann Goering is underestimating, is a handful of issues. Number one, they are majorly underestimating the radar capability. The British are ahead of the curve on radar technology. Everybody's using radar technology at this time. The Americans were using it on the West Coast and the East Coast. The British are using it, and the Germans are using it as well. Another factor is that at this period of time, the British are also working on breaking Enigma, which I'm going to talk about in a different lesson. That's the Enigma code. Are y'all familiar with that? So they are in the process of breaking that. The third thing that they're not anticipating is the resolve of the British people. They have prepared. Churchill, by May of 40, has prepared the British for an attack. He knows that if the attack is reached Western Europe, that it's inevitable that it will make its way to mainland England. So during this pre and early period of attack in the Battle of Britain, a lot of Londoners have sent their children to the countryside and to northern England and to other parts of the UK. They've gotten them out of the major cities. Now, that's not every child, but they're trying to move as many civilians, especially children, out of the city. Another factor that Goering and Hitler are not prepared for is that this is sort of like a double-edged sword. Good call. On the one side, you have horrible attacks on civilians. Civilian losses are in the hundreds of thousands. Like over 300,000 civilians die in these campaigns. But that gives the RAF enough time and Dowding enough time to pull everything back together. So they're able to repair planes. They're able to get more pilots trained. They're able to, and we're talking about pilots getting in the air with like maybe 10 hours flying experience, and they're in the middle of dogfights.
That's ridiculous. Today, if you want to get a private pilot license, you have to get, I think, like a minimum of 40 hours of flight, and not just a civilian flying your
Right.
license.
So I'll get to something in a second about the RAF and sort of their tactics here. Michelle, what's up?
You mentioned Alan Turing. Would you be willing to show a clip of him from the presentation making?
Oh yeah, and it's such a. So what I'll do is we'll talk about the breaking of the Enigma code. I've got a portion of my lessons where we're going to talk about every major code that's broken, and I also want to promote a opportunity for you guys coming up in April. The woman that wrote the book on the American code breakers, she's doing a book tour in Richmond coming up in April. So I'll get you guys that information as well. Yeah. Oh no. Yeah, it's incredible. So really, as a result of the movement toward bombing cities as opposed to military targets, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, emerges much stronger. They're able to force the Luftwaffe into these bombing campaigns. And sort of the tactic, even though they're spread thin and they're constantly going into these, they're landing, they're refueling, they're taking back off. The British fighters, the Spitfires, they're focused on fighting the Messerschmitts, the German Luftwaffe fighters, where the British Hawkers are focused on taking out the bombers. So because of radar, they knew where they were going to be, and this constant, again, it was a constant sort of nuisance to the Luftwaffe because every time the Luftwaffe is flying missions, here they are ready to attack, and the RAF is waiting on them. Another really important group that kind of gets left out of the story are the British air traffic controllers that disguise themselves as German air traffic controllers. They tapped in to the Luftwaffe radios, and they just sent these guys out to sea. So that was tremendously important in the Battle of Britain as well. Again, what truly turns the tide of this campaign is radar. It was vastly underestimated by Goering and Hitler, and it kept the RAF in the air, and it kept Lord Dowding one step ahead of the Luftwaffe. So again, this technology is not new, but is improved upon by the British. And the irony of this is, those should have been the targets along the coast, the system of radar along the east coast and the south coast of mainland England that the Nazis should have been focusing on. Obviously, this gave them an upper hand, and it played an important role in the defeat of the German Luftwaffe. As I said before, the British kept a stiff upper lip. We are all very familiar with this on the left, right? Keep calm and carry on. And if we were together last year, I already told you this is public domain now, so everybody's been using this in the last decade for a number of things like, keep calm and chive on, or keep calm and carry strong, right? So there's all types of different keep calm and do whatever. Well, that was the stiff upper lip of the British. They were using this piece of propaganda in 1939, 1940, and plastering it all over London, despite the fact that their city was being bombed out. This is a group of RAF soldiers, and what Churchill here says, never was so much owed to so many, by so many to so few, the Prime Minister. That these two pieces of propaganda were two of the most popular during the Battle of Britain. And then just a couple of months before the Battle of Britain begins, Churchill is anticipating an attack on London. This is just 3 days after Churchill comes into power as Prime Minister. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, and all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed by the dark. So Churchill, this is him wearing the helmet that a RAF scout would have worn during the bombing raids. I think that's one of the most awesome, iconic pictures of Churchill in any part of the war, especially with during the Battle of Britain. It's really wild. The bombing is nonstop. People just keep getting up in the morning, going to work, keeping their businesses open. Churchill's walking around in the streets, greeting people. They're not letting this attack change who they are. It is a remarkable moment of not only fortitude, but also integrity that they have for who they are, their culture, and the fact that they're not going to give up. So we've got, this is what the numbers look like, the stats. So you have just under 1,000 Luftwaffe bombers, about half that number in the Royal Air Force. The fighters are a little bit closer. Remember that the British were not willing to give up their fighters to go to other parts of the world. They wanted to keep them to defend the homeland. We talked about that earlier in the course. And then the losses are real lopsided by the end of the Battle of Britain. You've got just under 3,000 Luftwaffe shot down compared to that of the just under 1,000 RAF planes that were shot down. So what we've got here, we have British Spitfire fighters attacking the German Stukas. This is your British Spitfire fighter. This is your typical dogfight between Spitfires and Messerschmitts. Take an opportunity in chapter 2 to read, let me pull the page for you. If you have not done so, It is page. Let's see. 40. Actually, 39, 40. This is pretty cool. This is, yeah, it starts on 39 and it goes to 40. Nope, never mind. It starts on 38 and it goes to 40. And it is the first-hand experience of a British RAF pilot in a dogfight. It's pretty cool. Has anybody read it yet? All right, you guys should all read that. 38, 39, and 40. Take a look at that. Here we have the Hawker Hurricane. These are the planes that typically went after the German bombers. And then we've got we talked about the Stuka bomber, the Dornier bomber, the Ju-88 bomber, and the Me-110 fighter bomber, developed by Messerschmitt as well. Here's your Messerschmitt Me-109. That's the one of the real fast German fighters. We'll talk later as the war goes on about the Messerschmitt jet by the end of the war. And then your FW-190 over there on the right. And then this is another famous bomber from the Battle of Britain. This is the Heinkel 3. The Heinkel bombers were also targeted by the Hawker Hurricanes. And then again, British radar really turns the tide of the Battle of Britain throughout this months-long campaign. This is the Air Warden that we looked at before. He's watching for German bombers atop a building in London. Pretty wild. These are the docks of London. You're probably familiar with this. Familiar with this image right here? What is that? Yeah, it's Tower Bridge. Not London Bridge, but Tower Bridge near the Tower of London. So the docks of London are burning. Fires in London burned for months. Here's a bombed out building and double-decker bus. Firefighters firefighters and first responders should receive a great deal of credit. Most of the first responders in the Battle of Britain were your age. If you didn't volunteer to fight, you were picking up the pieces. So they were in their teens, 20s, and most that could join had already joined either the Army, Royal Air Force, or the Royal Navy. More images of London burning. Bombed out cathedral. Londoners slept in the underground, in the subway systems, in subway stations to avoid the bombs. This is a woman and her children. There's another couple of people that I want you to take note of in chapter 2. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent, we're going to talk a bit about him later. His description of the bombing raids on London, I believe is on around page, and it's in the 40s of chapter 2. It's pretty incredible. And then Edward R. Murrow, he is the sort of the voice of the war. We're going to talk a bit about him later. I've got film clips that I'm going to show you guys of the early part of the war and throughout the war, where he's narrating a story. He was not just a random voice of narration. He was actually on the ground investigating the war and reporting. Here's some children sitting outside their home that had been bombed out. And then we have another Dr. Seuss cartoon. Set a bird in the midst of the blitz. Up to now, we've scored very few hits. So I'll sit on my canny old Star-Spangled Fanny, and on it, he sits and he sits. So we have Uncle Sam here, home sweet home, with the bombs dropping all around him and staying in a sort of the formation of isolationism, even though we're moving away from that with the destroyer deal, Lend-Lease, etc. Any questions about the Battle of Britain or the London Blitz? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Battle of Atlantic. I am only going to introduce this. The Battle of Atlantic stays with us throughout the year, or throughout the course. Because the Battle of Atlantic starts in January of 40, but it goes all the way to 45. Obviously, the focus here, U-boat attacks and plans like Operation Sea Lion that didn't work out. Hitler abandons Operation Sea Lion by the fall into the winter of 40. Large convoys of both merchant ships carrying supply and later large convoys of soldiers. Yeah. Amphibious assault, water to land of Britain. By taking out their air corps, they could then focus on the Navy, and then they could launch attacks on the defended. You have to think about like southern England and the west coast. Like that's the geography alone would be difficult to invade, because like on the southern coast is like the cliffs of Dover and a number of other geographically strategic places to launch assaults. Yeah.
Why did Ireland stay neutral?
Similar situation, like when we talked about with Turkey, there are going to be folks that will come over and fight, but a lot of that comes down to politics, comes down to a little bit of religion. They're going to stay out, they're going to actually end up staying out of it and not getting on the Allied side, because they do not want to fight against the British. Do keep in mind that as the World War I is coming to an end, actually the start of World War I or the end of World War I, that's the period in which like the Irish revolution was taking place, like between them, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and what will become Northern Ireland, and Great Britain. So that has a lot to do with the fact that they stay neutral in this engagement as well.
Aren't they also dealing with that giant famine? Or is that
Well, the Depression hit them hard. The potato famine was in the 1840s, 50s. So that's where you start to see like large wave immigration prior to theirs. Yeah.
Okay, I was confused.
Things were not good.
Yeah, things were not.
They were definitely,
with depression.
they struggled with the Depression. So statistics and losses, and then obviously we're going to look at American ship construction. So the U-boats, these are the the German submarines, the wolf packs. They are going to launch attacks throughout the Atlantic. They're going to make their way into the Mediterranean. Obviously a big focal point of taking Norway and Denmark was to have ports that the U-boats and the German Navy could sail out of. a goal here was to sink British shipping, starve the UK into surrendering. And what the U-boats will do, they'll sink hundreds of ships. And the British Navy had a very hard time stopping them early on. There is one thing that really improves the British against not only the U-boats but the mines, and that's the use of copper wiring. They're not only using radar or sonar, but they're going to start using copper wiring so they can, so the mines are not as lethal to the ships. The mines were easy to drop, but they were devastating to any ship that came across them. And then that technology improves to be able to detect the boats as well. Furthermore, back to the Enigma issue, once the Enigma code is broken, they have to be very selective on how they act on information that they get. So if they know that there's a wolf pack attack, they can't necessarily just go out and attack the wolf pack out of fear that they'll know that the British have broken the Enigma code, which the British called Ultra, because Churchill called it the ultra secret trying to think of the last part. I don't know if he called it like the ultra secret project or the ultra secret plan. It might have just been the ultra secret project. So yeah, the breaking of the code of Enigma was just called Ultra. And what they're going to end up doing is, honestly, the reason that Enigma is broken is not just because of the people involved, but it's also because of British commandos that are going to apprehend Enigma machines and get them to the code breakers. So we have neutrality patrols. FDR starts helping the British by sending over warships as convoys and to provide protection. And then you can kind of see the lopsided statistics here. Way more ships are sunk in the North Atlantic than in any other area of the globe during World War II. And then you can see the number of ships sunk by various causes, whether they be, various causes would be other battleships, destroyers, or by depth charges or mines. Sunk by submarines, you see the most significant number there in 42. But do know that the British and the American submarine programs are going to become pretty advanced by the end of the war. So this is a chart of the Allied merchant ships sunk by German submarines from 39 to 45. So we have way more ships sunk than U-boats sunk as a result. But that number ticks up in 43, 44, where more U-boats are being sunk, and in 44, more U-boats sunk than ships sunk. And then a lot of this has to do with U.S. shipbuilding. And as Virginians, we can definitely point to the ship program as being pretty important for the buildup of Virginia's economy. The Norfolk Naval Yard becomes the main ship producer on the East Coast in the United States. So now you've got a lopsided, by 43, 44, 45, more U.S. ships are being produced than Allied ships being sunk. Again, a lot of this comes down to defense spending. So you go from 1.7 billion, which is over 20 billion today, to 6 billion, which is over 66 billion today, in just a 2-year period from 1939 to 1941. And then the total cost of the war was roughly 288 billion in 1940 dollars. This on the bottom left is a large convoy, and this on the right is a graph just with the increase in spending in just over a year. One thing that's going to push for that is going to be the sinking of the Robin Moore, the Greer, the Kearney, and the Reuben James, right? Those 4 American ships. This is an unarmed merchant ship sunk. And then all 3 of the others were what? What were they? Starts with a D. Destroyers, very good. The other 3 were destroyers. Fantastic. Did we already talk about the Robin Moore before? Not really? Okay. So the Robin Moore is sunk in May of 1941. And this actually has a lot to do with Lend-Lease in America providing war supply to the British, the Soviets, the Chinese, among other nations. By July of 1941, FDR made the decision for U.S. warships to help convoy merchant ships to Iceland. And as I told you guys, I believe a few lessons back, typically those convoys were met by British convoys, and then the British took over in Iceland, and then the British took the ships the rest of the way. A convoy is basically sending warships to guard merchant ships and protection from them being sunk by submarines. Yeah, it's an escort. In 1941, 25 U.S. tankers were sunk off the Atlantic coast. U.S. cities, as I mentioned before, refused blackouts, like New York. They thought it would hurt tourism. And in the first 6 months of 1942, 230 Allied ships were sunk. It's amazing to think of the amount of ships sunk in World War II in the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the thousands. Wow. So, in the North Atlantic, I've got the locations of what we've already talked about. We talked about the Greer, the Kearney, and the Reuben James. And then we also talked about the Atlantic Conference that led to the Atlantic Charter between Roosevelt and Churchill in Newfoundland. And then what I've also provided for you here is a map of the convoy routes from the United States to Iceland, the British Isles, and ultimately the Mediterranean. And that is lesson 5. You guys have any questions? You guys good? Cool. All right, so stop this.